This story is about the elevator of whispers. Jason was a 25-year-old college student, juggling classes and a demanding part-time job at a towering office building downtown. The place was sleek and modern by day, but at night, it transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and unsettling silence. One Tuesday evening, Jason wrapped up his late shift, the fluorescent lights casting harsh, sterile beams over empty desks and abandoned conference rooms. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Jason stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. The doors closed with a heavy finality, sealing him in, and he leaned against the mirrored wall. The machinery hummed, and the elevator began its descent. About 10 floors down, the elevator jolted violently. The lights flickered, and Jason's heart slammed against his ribcage. The sudden stop left the air feeling heavy, oppressive. It was the kind of thing you'd expect in terrifying tales or ghost stories, but this was all too real. He swallowed hard and reached out to press the emergency button. Nothing happened. A sinking feeling took hold as he hit the button repeatedly, his fingers growing numb with fear. The elevator didn't move. His phone, predictably, had no signal. He was trapped. Then, something strange happened. It started as a faint rustling, almost like the whisper of a breeze against the elevator doors. Jason held his breath, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, transforming into a symphony of voices, whispering, murmuring, overlapping in a way that made his skin crawl. It was like a conversation happening just out of reach, a cacophony of haunting whispers echoing from nowhere. "Hello?" Jason's voice wavered, cracking under the weight of his anxiety. The whispers didn't respond. They grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of unseen beings arguing over his presence. He could almost pick out words, but they slipped through his comprehension like grains of sand. The temperature in the elevator plummeted, and his breath fogged up in the icy air. It felt like he had been plunged into a deep freeze, the kind that numbs you to the bone, like one of those sleep stories gone horribly wrong. Jason's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, desperately trying to use the flashlight. The small beam of light offered little comfort. He swept it around the elevator, illuminating corners that now felt sinister and threatening. The whispers suddenly stopped, plunging him into a silence that was even more terrifying. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, a void that swallowed every sound, like in true scary horror stories that keep you up at night. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he felt something. The air in the elevator seemed to vibrate, and he swore he felt a presence right behind him. He spun around, his flashlight trembling, but there was nothing there. He tried to steady his breathing, but fear had a stranglehold on him. Then, he noticed something in the mirrored wall opposite him. A shadow, not his own, moved. It slithered across the reflection, taking the shape of a figure, a tall, featureless shadow with eyes that glowed a deep, malevolent red. It was the embodiment of nightmare fuel, something from one of those haunted tales you never forget. Jason stumbled backward, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst out of his chest. The shadow in the mirror tilted its head, observing him. The red eyes flickered like dying embers, and then, as if the creature had grown tired of the game, it moved. The shadow glided forward, and Jason felt a rush of cold air brush past his face. He screamed, finally finding his voice, but the sound was swallowed by the confined space. His breath came out in ragged gasps, and he pounded on the elevator doors, desperate to escape. The shadows seemed to ripple around him, and for a moment, Jason saw faces pressing against the mirrored walls, horrible, distorted visages with eyes sunken deep into hollow sockets, mouths wide open in silent, eternal screams. Their ghostly forms seemed to writhe and twist, trying to break through the glass, and Jason could feel their hatred, an energy that crackled like electricity through the air. He closed his eyes, but the images burned in his mind, refusing to let go. The whispers returned, but now they sounded furious, a cacophony of wails and hissing voices that spoke of ancient anger and pain, like a scene out of one of those true horror stories told around campfires. Then came the sound of scratching. clawing, like nails on metal, from somewhere above. Jason glanced up, and his eyes widened as he noticed the elevator ceiling buckling, as though something massive and monstrous was crawling on top, trying to force its way in. His body was paralyzed with terror, the dread so thick that it felt like he was drowning in it. The cold breath of something unseen blew against the back of his neck, and he could swear he felt fingers, impossibly cold and bony, brushing against his skin. It was a moment ripped from the most chilling scares imaginable. The elevator shuddered, and the lights flickered once more. The whispers returned, louder and angrier, echoing in his ears. Jason fell to his knees, clutching his head, as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying for it to stop. Just as he thought he might lose his mind, the elevator jolted back to life. The lights brightened, the whispers vanished, and the doors slid open to the lobby. Jason scrambled out, collapsing onto the marble floor. The night guard approached, concern etched across his face, but Jason couldn't speak. The experience had left him shaken, and the whispers echoed in his mind long after he had stumbled out of that building. The night guard's voice barely registered as Jason sat on the cold marble floor, his entire body trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him out. His ears still rang with the ghostly cacophony of those haunting whispers, and every shadow in the lobby seemed to shift and stretch, as if the darkness itself were alive. He glanced back at the elevator doors, which had closed as if nothing had happened. But in the polished metal surface, Jason swore he saw a fleeting reflection of those glowing red eyes, watching him, hungry for another chance to trap him in that confined nightmare. From that night on, Jason avoided elevators at all costs. Even the thought of stepping inside one made his skin crawl. This story is about the haunting of Building 46. Michelle was a seasoned building inspector, known for her meticulous work and no-nonsense attitude. When she was assigned to inspect Building 46, a newly constructed high-rise that was still half-empty, she didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The place felt steeped in paranormal energy, like the kind of eerie experiences whispered about in ghost stories. The place was eerily silent, with only the occasional hum of electricity breaking the stillness. Michelle pressed the button for the elevator, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hand. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and she stepped inside, selecting the top floor for her inspection. The doors closed, and the elevator began its smooth ascent. She exhaled, grateful for the moment of peace, but that sense of calm was shattered when the elevator reached the 13th floor. The lights flickered, and the elevator stopped abruptly. The doors slid open, revealing a half-finished hallway bathed in flickering fluorescent light. Exposed wiring hung from the ceiling, and plastic sheeting rustled with an invisible breeze. Michelle frowned, stepping forward. The floor shouldn't have been active, and there shouldn't have been any air currents this high up. It felt like she had stepped into a scene from one of those true scary horror stories that get under your skin. Her radio crackled, breaking the silence, but the static was soon replaced by something else, whispers. Her heart skipped a beat. She raised the radio to her ear, but she couldn't make out the words. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she swore she heard her name whispered in a breathy, chilling tone. The clipboard slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground. She backed away, her pulse racing. The hallway felt wrong, as though she had stepped into another world, a haunted realm filled with haunting whispers and chilling scares. The whispers were no longer just whispers, they became distinct, ghostly murmurs that seemed to breathe in her ear. Michelle felt cold fingers graze the back of her neck, making her whip around, but there was no one there. Her breath quickened as the fluorescent lights above her began to buzz and flicker erratically, casting distorted shadows that twisted and writhed like living creatures. It was like a scene from an animated horror nightmare. One shadow in particular caught her attention. It seemed to detach from the wall and crawl across the floor, moving in a jerky, spider-like fashion before vanishing into the darkness. A chill coursed down her spine, and her instincts screamed for her to get out. She took a step back toward the elevator, and that's when the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath misted in front of her, and the air felt heavy, oppressive, like it was filled with unseen eyes. The walls of the hallway seemed to close in, narrowing and pulsating with a heartbeat-like rhythm. Michelle could almost hear it. A deep, rhythmic thudding echoing in her ears, as if the building itself were alive and hungry. Panic took hold, and she nearly stumbled over her own feet as she tried to escape the suffocating hallway. Then, she saw him. At the end of the corridor stood a man dressed in a dirty construction uniform. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light. It was the kind of apparition you'd expect to encounter in haunted tales. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. The man stood perfectly still, his head cocked at an odd angle. For a moment, she thought he might be a construction worker playing a cruel joke, but there was something horribly off about him. His limbs seemed too long, too thin, and his mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide, as if he had emerged from sleep stories meant to terrify. "Who are you?" Michelle demanded, her voice shaking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, his body jerking unnaturally, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Michelle stumbled back, pressing the elevator button repeatedly. The man's movements grew faster, his limbs flailing grotesquely as he sprinted toward her. The buzzing lights above shattered, plunging the hallway into near darkness, and Michelle was surrounded by the sound of shattering glass and ghostly, echoing laughter. It was the kind of thing that would turn any building inspector's real nightmares into a living horror story. Just as he reached the elevator, the doors slammed shut, and the car rocketed upward. Michelle collapsed against the wall, her legs weak. Her radio crackled again, and this time, she heard her name clearly. Michelle, the voice was low, almost mocking, and it sent a chill down her spine. The lights in the elevator flickered, and she felt a cold presence right beside her, as if someone, or something, was breathing down her neck. She didn't dare turn around. It felt as though a pair of icy, unseen hands were hovering inches from her shoulders, ready to grab her at any moment. The elevator jolted violently, and Michelle's heart leapt into her throat. Shadows danced across the walls of the elevator, shapes that shouldn't have been there, twisting and stretching into grotesque forms. One of the shadows seemed to peel itself off the wall, reaching for her with elongated, skeletal fingers. Michelle pressed herself against the far corner, her chest heaving. The whispers returned, now angry, demanding, as if the spirits that haunted this building were furious that she had escaped their trap. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw faces pressed against the mirrored walls, their hollow eyes weeping black tears. The experience was more terrifying than any trucker horror story she had ever heard. When the elevator finally reached the top floor, the doors opened, and she bolted out, not stopping until she was outside. This story is about the sleep paralysis incident. Sam was a software engineer who often pulled all-nighters at the office. The building where he worked was a gleaming high-rise, the kind that looked beautiful during the day but turned ominous at night. One evening, after hours of debugging code, Sam finally decided to call it a night. The office was empty, silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. He gathered his things and made his way to the elevator. The elevator doors opened with a soft hiss, and he stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent. Sam leaned against the mirrored wall, his body heavy with exhaustion. As he closed his eyes for a moment, the elevator shuddered to a stop, and the lights dimmed. He snapped awake, every muscle in his body tense. The lights flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows. Sam tried pressing the buttons, but the elevator remained frozen. Then, he felt it, a wave of intense drowsiness, as if an invisible force was pulling him into a deep sleep. His limbs went limp, his body frozen in place. He couldn't move, couldn't even blink. It felt like sleep paralysis, but he was awake, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The shadow figure moved closer, and Sam felt an icy breath on his neck. The pressure in the elevator grew suffocating, and he could hear a faint, sinister whisper. The shadow leaned in, and Sam's body shook with terror. The whispers grew louder, more menacing, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. The shadow reached out a hand, its touch like ice, and he felt a searing pain where it made contact. Then, from the corner of his eye, Sam noticed something even more horrifying. The shadows in the corners of the elevator began to shift and crawl, as if a colony of shadowy insects had come to life. They skittered across the walls, merging into grotesque shapes with mouths that seemed to gape open, whispering secrets of unspeakable horrors. The distorted reflections in the mirrored walls began to move independently, each one morphing into twisted versions of himself with eyes that leaked black tears. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched from all angles, every part of the elevator alive with dark energy. A metallic scraping noise filled the confined space, like nails dragging across steel, and Sam's heart nearly stopped. The sound came from above, and he tilted his head just enough to see the ceiling panel quivering. It bent inward as though something was trying to force its way inside. The panel finally burst open, and for a split second, Sam saw skeletal hands, bony and clawed, reaching down toward him. They vanished as quickly as they appeared, but the memory of those bone-chilling claws was etched into his mind. The red-eyed shadow figure leaned in even closer, and Sam could feel its breath, cold and rotten, on his face. Its whispers changed, turning into mocking laughter that echoed through the elevator. The creature lifted a shadowy hand and pressed it against Sam's chest. The pain was blinding, a cold that burned like dry ice. Sam thought he might black out, his vision narrowing as the shadow's grip seemed to pull his very soul from his body. Just when he thought he would pass out, the lights flickered back to full brightness. The shadow disappeared, and Sam collapsed onto the elevator floor, gasping for air. The elevator resumed its descent, and when the doors opened, he stumbled out, barely able to stand. The night guard rushed over, but Sam couldn't explain what had happened. He knew that he had come face to face with something evil, something that didn't belong in the realm of the living. Other employees later told him about similar incidents, episodes of sleep paralysis in the elevator, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. Sam stopped working late, taking the stairs whenever possible. But even that didn't fully erase the terror he felt. The memory of the shadow, the red eyes, and the whisper that seemed to come from another world haunted him, turning his sleep into a series of horrifying, restless nights. Even when he was home, Sam couldn't escape the feeling that the shadows were waiting, ready to claim him the moment he let his guard down.